The highway stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of cracked asphalt, illuminated only by the feeble glow of my headlights. The clock on the dashboard blinked 1:13 a.m., though it felt later. I'd been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the tires against the road and the occasional wail of wind against the windows my only company. The GPS had stopped working miles ago, its cheerful voice replaced by an empty, silent map. My phone was equally unhelpful, flashing no service, no matter where I held it. I told myself I wasn't lost, just misdirected. The plan had been to cut through the back roads and shave off some time, but now I was wondering if that had been a mistake. The highway signs had grown sparse, and the ones I'd seen were too weathered to be legible. I turned the radio dial, searching for anything to break the oppressive silence. Most stations were static, the occasional burst of garbled music fading as quickly as it came. And then I found it. Amid the sea of white noise, a faint signal emerged. At first, it sounded like nothing more than a low hum, barely perceptible beneath the static. But as I tuned in, the sound grew clearer. It wasn't music. It wasn't even a voice, at least not at first. It was whispers, words fragmented and overlapping, too soft to make out completely. I felt a prickle of unease but kept listening, drawn to the station despite myself. The whispers ebbed and flowed, growing louder and then receding into the static. And then, unmistakably, I heard it. John. My hands tightened on the wheel. It was my name, clear, deliberate, and unmistakable. I glanced around, half expecting to see another car on the deserted highway, but I was alone. The voice, if it was even a voice, continued, threading itself through the static. "Do you remember?" it asked, soft and lilting. "Remember what?" I muttered under my breath. My own voice startled me in the silence. More whispers followed, disjointed phrases that sent a shiver down my spine. "Where are you going?" "It's been so long." "You left us." Each word seemed to burrow into my skull, an itch I couldn't scratch. I reached for the knob to turn it off, but the radio didn't respond. The dial wouldn't budge, and the power button was useless. I tried to switch to another station, but the whispers only grew louder, overlapping until they became a low, distorted growl. I felt my pulse quicken. This had to be some kind of prank, I told myself. Some late-night shock jock messing with insomniacs like me. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that the radio, whatever it was talking directly to me. "John," the voice called again, slower this time, as though savoring each letter. I glanced at the rearview mirror out of habit, half expecting to see someone in the back seat. The reflection stared back at me, warped slightly by the dim light. Nothing there, just my own tired eyes and the dark road behind me. But the voice didn't stop. "Do you remember what you did?" My breath hitched. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what it wanted. I only knew I needed it to stop. I jabbed at the buttons on the radio, desperate to silence it, but the whispers persisted. Louder now, layered with faint laughter and something else. A sound I couldn't place, like dirt being shoveled. The whispers were everywhere, filling the car, crawling under my skin. The voice, the static. It wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. It was in my head. And then, as suddenly as it started, the static faded. Silence. I exhaled, gripping the wheel tighter. My shoulders sagged and I allowed myself a nervous laugh. It was over. Just a glitch, I thought. Or maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, a trick of exhaustion and paranoia. But as the quiet settled in, I heard it again. Not from the radio this time, but from somewhere deeper, just behind my ears. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible. "It's just the beginning." The highway seemed darker after that. The shadows cast by the trees lining the road felt deeper, more alive, as though they shifted just beyond the reach of my headlights. My fingers trembled on the wheel as I kept glancing at the radio. The silence was almost worse than the whispers. I couldn't tell if it was off or simply waiting. I'd driven for maybe 10 minutes when it started again, a faint crackle, like an old vinyl record, just before the music begins. Then the static returned. This time the voice came immediately, clear and cold as ice. "Where are you going, John?" it asked. I didn't answer. I didn't even breathe. The voice carried on, its tone somehow both calm and accusatory. "You've been running for a long time, haven't you?" A chill ran down my spine. I gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles whitening as I forced my focus back to the road. My foot pressed harder on the gas. Whatever this was, I wanted to be far away from it. But the voice, it knew things. "You can't run from the past, John. Do you remember the woods? Do you remember what you did?" I shook my head, teeth clenched. "No," I whispered, though the denial felt hollow even as I said it. The radio hissed, and the voice, deeper now, almost a growl, laughed. "Oh, but you do. You remember everything, even the things you buried." I tried to turn the radio off again, but the knob was as useless as before. My fingers slipped as if the plastic had grown slick, and my stomach twisted into knots. The whispers began to rise again, layered with the sound of dirt being shoveled. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was vivid, like I could feel the cold earth against my skin, hear the dull scrape of metal on rock. And then came the memories. At first they were flashes, disjointed and fleeting. A clearing in the woods, the glint of moonlight on a shovel. My hands raw and blistered. But as the voice continued, they became more vivid, more complete. It described them in detail, recounting events I couldn't place yet felt deep in my gut. Events I didn't want to believe were real. The voice spoke of a girl, a name I couldn't catch, though it sounded familiar. It spoke of laughter turned to screams, of promises broken, and of silence. It spoke of a night long past, a secret buried deep. And as it spoke, I began to see her, not just in my mind, but in the corner of my eye. A pale figure standing in the shadows along the roadside, her face obscured by her long dark hair. Every time I turned to look, she was gone, yet her presence lingered like a ghostly echo. I drove faster, the engine whining in protest. The road twisted and turned, but I barely noticed. All I could hear was the voice. All I could see was her. "Do you remember now?" the voice asked, softer this time, almost tender. "Do you remember what you took from her?" My chest tightened. I wanted to scream, to shout back that I didn't know, that I couldn't know. But deep down I felt the weight of the answer pressing on me, heavy and cold. The static grew louder, drowning out the voice. My head pounded, and the edges of my vision blurred. I thought I saw her again, standing in the middle of the road this time, her arms outstretched as if to stop me. My reflexes kicked in and I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching against the pavement as I struggled to keep control. It came to a stop, just inches from where she'd been. But when I looked again, she was gone. The radio fell silent once more, leaving me alone with the sound of my ragged breathing and the faint smell of burnt rubber. But I knew it wasn't over, not yet. The air in the car felt heavier, oppressive. My hands trembled as I shifted the gear into drive and eased back onto the road, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around. Where would I go, though? The road behind me was as dark and unwelcoming as the one ahead. The radio's silence was unnerving. I'd grown accustomed to the whispers, even their malevolent undertones. Without them, the quiet left space for something worse, my thoughts. Fragments of the voice's accusations echoed in my mind, blending with the flashes of memories it had stirred. A girl's laughter, a sudden scream, the taste of metallic fear on my tongue. My grip tightened on the wheel as my breathing quickened. I tried to focus on the road, on the rhythmic blur of dashed lines. But my eyes betrayed me, darting to the shadows at the edges of the headlights, searching for her. I didn't want to remember. Whatever the voice was trying to show me, I wanted no part of it. But the harder I tried to push it away, the more vividly it returned. My hands on a shovel, dirt flying in the moonlight. A promise I'd made, broken under the weight of desperation. A noise broke through the quiet, low and distant at first. It wasn't the static this time. It was the sound of a shovel striking earth. Slow, methodical. Each impact sent a jolt through my chest. I glanced at the radio, expecting it to come alive again, but it remained dark. The sound was coming from outside. No, inside. It was inside me, in my head, reverberating like an unrelenting heartbeat. I clenched my teeth and pressed the gas pedal harder, the engine growling in protest. The sound grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then I saw her, She stood by the side of the road, her head tilted slightly, as though curious. Her long hair hung in dark, tangled strands, obscuring her face. My chest tightened as I drove past, too afraid to stop, too afraid to look away. But as I glanced into the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. She was there, standing in the middle of the road, closer than she should have been. Her head was still tilted, her hair still obscuring her face, but I could feel her watching me. I pressed the gas pedal harder, the car lurching forward as I tried to outrun her. The road stretched endlessly ahead, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. My headlights illuminated nothing but more shadows, more emptiness. The sound of the shovel striking earth grew louder, more insistent, pounding in time with my heartbeat. And then the voice returned. "You can't escape it, John. You can't escape her." It wasn't coming from the radio this time. It was everywhere, inside the car, inside my head. My vision blurred as the whispers grew louder, layering over each other until they became a cacophony. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The car jerked violently to the side as I veered too close to the edge of the road. Gravel sprayed against the undercarriage, and I fought to regain control. The whispers subsided just enough for me to hear her laugh, a sound that was both innocent and cruel. It was the laugh of the girl I couldn't remember, the girl I couldn't forget. "You took everything from her," the voice said, calm and cold. "Now she'll take everything from you." I gripped the wheel so tightly, my knuckles ached. "No," I whispered, though I didn't know if I was denying the voice or pleading with it. The road ahead seemed to narrow, the darkness closing in like a noose. The headlights flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw the trees lining the road twist and bend, their branches reaching toward the car like skeletal fingers. My pulse thundered in my ears as I sped up, desperate to find an end to this nightmare. But deep down, I knew there was no escaping it. Not her, not the truth, not myself. The sound of the shovel striking earth returned, louder than ever, accompanied by the faint, unmistakable smell of freshly turned soil. The voice whispered one final question, its tone dripping with quiet menace. "Do you remember yet?" And in the darkness ahead, I saw her waiting for me. The car felt like it was suffocating me. The air was thick, cloying, and no matter how hard I tried to breathe, I couldn't seem to fill my lungs. My knuckles were white on the wheel as I pushed the car harder, the engine roaring in protest. The road didn't end. It stretched into infinity, a cruel, looping nightmare. And she was always there. Sometimes I'd see her in the shadows by the roadside, her silhouette a dark blemish against the gloom. Other times, she was in the rearview mirror, her presence a ghostly stain on the periphery of my vision. No matter where I looked, she was there, silent, watching, waiting. The static returned without warning, cutting through the silence like a knife. I flinched, nearly swerving off the road, as the whispers began again. "John." The voice was soft, almost gentle now, but it carried a weight that pressed down on me. "You can't run from the past," it said, the words dripping with cold finality. "I don't remember," I shouted, slamming my fist against the steering wheel. The sound of my own voice startled me. It was raw, desperate, like a man grasping at the last thread of his sanity. The radio hissed, and the voice responded, its tone low and mocking. "Oh, but you do. You buried it deep, didn't you? Thought you could forget. Thought it would stay hidden forever." The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a maddening hum. Images flashed in my mind, fleeting, fragmented, but undeniable. The woods, the shovel. Her laughter soft and musical, turning to a scream that echoed in my skull. I shook my head violently, as if I could dislodge the memories. "No," I muttered. "No, no, no." The road began to change. The asphalt cracked and crumbled, the smooth surface giving way to dirt and gravel. The car jolted and rattled as the tires struggled for traction, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. Ahead, the darkness seemed to pulse, shifting and writhing like a living thing. My headlights flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw the outline of trees, tall, gnarled, and ancient, their branches stretching upward like claws. The woods. "No," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "I'm not going back there." But the car didn't listen. It kept moving forward, drawn by some unseen force. The radio crackled again, and the voice spoke, softer this time, almost coaxing. "It's time to finish what you started, John." I gritted my teeth, my vision blurring as tears welled up unbidden. The memories were coming faster now, slamming into me like waves. Her face, soft, smiling, innocent. The sound of her voice filled with trust. And then the shovel in my hands, the weight of it, the way the earth had given way beneath it. The car came to a sudden stop, jerking me forward against the seatbelt. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me in suffocating silence. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the ignition, but the key wouldn't turn. "John," her voice this time, not the one from the radio, hers, soft, broken, and so close I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I froze, my breath hitching as I slowly turned to look out the window. She was there, standing just outside the car, her pale face illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard. Her hair clung to her skin, damp and matted, and her eyes, oh God, her eyes, were hollow, empty pits that seemed to suck the light out of the world around her. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. Her lips parted, and she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's time to dig, John." The shovel was in the back seat. I didn't remember putting it there, but as I stared at it, my hands trembling, I knew there was no denying it. It was time. The air outside was colder than I'd expected, biting through my thin jacket as I stepped out of the car. The dirt road stretched behind me, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Ahead, the forest loomed, its branches tangled together like skeletal fingers blocking out the sky. I didn't want to go in. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around, to run, to forget this ever happened. But my feet moved on their own, crunching the gravel beneath them as I approached the trees. The shovel was heavy in my hands. I hadn't even realized I'd picked it up until I felt its weight. The metal blade gleamed faintly in the dim light, a cruel reminder of what I was walking toward. Her voice guided me. "This way," she whispered. Her words carried on the cold wind that threaded through the trees. I couldn't see her, but I felt her presence, an oppressive weight pressing against my chest. The forest seemed to close in around me as I stepped deeper into the shadows, the gnarled branches clawing at my jacket like they were trying to hold me back. The whispers returned, rising and falling like the tide. They weren't just coming from her anymore. They were everywhere, surrounding me, seeping into my skin. Words overlapped, disjointed and fragmented, but their meaning was clear. "Keep going. Almost there. Time to remember." The ground beneath my boots grew softer, the crunch of gravel replaced by the squelch of damp earth. I could smell it now, the rich, loamy scent of freshly turned soil. My stomach churned, but I didn't stop. I came to a clearing. The moonlight barely pierced through the canopy, but it was enough to see by. The ground here was uneven, marked by patches of disturbed earth and jagged stones jutting out like broken teeth. And in the center of the clearing, there was a mound. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. The mound was small, barely a foot high, and overgrown with moss and weeds. But it wasn't natural. It was deliberate, a grave. My hands tightened on the shovel as the memories came rushing back. The forest, the girl, her laughter, her screams, my promises, empty and brittle as the branches above. The voice spoke again, soft and insistent. "Dig!" I didn't want to. God help me, I didn't want to. But my hands moved on their own, driving the shovel into the earth. The sound was deafening in the silence, the blade slicing through roots and soil with brutal efficiency. With every shovelful of dirt I tossed aside, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just voices anymore. They were screams, laughter, sobs. They echoed in my head, drowning out my own thoughts, until all I could hear was the cacophony of her. The shovel hit something solid. I froze, my chest heaving as I stared at the ground. The whispers stopped, leaving behind an eerie, suffocating silence. Slowly I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I brushed away the remaining dirt. The moonlight caught on something pale and smooth. Bone, a hand. My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat as I scrambled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The hand was small, delicate, its fingers curled as though reaching for something. And then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, her hollow eyes locked on mine. Her hair hung in dark, wet strands around her face, and her lips curled into something that might have been a smile, if it weren't so full of malice. "You remember now," she said, her voice echoing inside my skull. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there frozen under her gaze, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the soft earth. "You promised," she whispered. "You promised you'd never leave me." Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head. "I didn't mean—" "You buried me," she said, her voice rising, cold and sharp as broken glass. "You left me here to rot." The earth around the grave began to shift, the dirt churning as though something beneath it was struggling to break free. The air grew colder, the wind howling through the trees like a chorus of wailing voices, and then, with a sound like a crack of thunder, the mound collapsed inward. She smiled, her hollow eyes glinting with something dark and hungry. "It's your turn now, John." The ground beneath me gave way. I fell. The sensation of falling was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just my body. It felt like my mind, my memories, and every piece of my being were unraveling as I plunged into the darkness. The wind roared in my ears, carrying faint whispers that sounded like her voice but layered with others, too many to count. And then abruptly, it stopped. I hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. For a moment I lay there, dazed and gasping for breath. The surface beneath me was cold and damp, an unnatural texture somewhere between soil and flesh. When I finally opened my eyes, I found myself in a place that shouldn't exist. The world around me was a grotesque mirror of the forest above. The trees were gnarled and blackened, their branches twisted into shapes that resembled skeletal hands. The ground was a patchwork of cracked earth and pools of stagnant water, reflecting a sky that churned with sickly green and gray clouds. The air smelled of decay, heavy and cloying. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the shovel like a lifeline. The whispers were louder here, a constant background noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They weren't just sounds, they carried emotions, rage, sorrow, despair, each one hitting me like a physical blow. She was waiting for me. Her figure stood at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the shadows of the grotesque trees. Her head tilted slightly, the same way it had on the roadside. But here, there was no pretense of humanity left in her form. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and stretched too tightly over her bones. Her eyes were deep hollows, glowing faintly with a sickly light. "You belong here," she said, her voice cutting through the whispers like a knife. "No," I choked out, shaking my head. My voice sounded weak, almost drowned out by the oppressive noise. This isn't real. I didn't mean—" Her laugh was cold and hollow, a sound that sent shivers racing down my spine. "Didn't mean?" she echoed. "You meant every word, every lie, every promise." I stumbled backward, the shovel clanging against the ground as I tried to put distance between us. But the forest seemed to shift around me, closing in, leaving nowhere to run. "You buried me," she continued, stepping closer with an unnatural grace. Her feet didn't touch the ground. "You buried the truth. You thought you could forget, but the earth remembers. I remember." The ground beneath me began to shift again, cracks spidering outward as though the very earth was alive. I could feel it pulling at me, dragging me down with every step I tried to take. "Please," I begged, though I wasn't sure who I was pleading with. Her, myself, whatever force had brought me here. "I'll make it right. There is no making it right," she hissed. Her face twisted into something monstrous, her hollow eyes burning with fury. "You can't bring back what you've taken." The whispers swelled, rising to a deafening crescendo as the ground gave way beneath my feet once more. I fell again, deeper this time. The air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. Images flashed through my mind, fragments of memories I'd tried so hard to suppress. The girl. Her name was Emily. I remembered now, as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Her laughter, bright and carefree, echoing through the woods as we walked together. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about her dreams. And then the fight. The way her laughter had turned to anger, her eyes filled with betrayal as she screamed at me. The argument had spiraled out of control, fueled by my own fear and frustration. I remembered the shove, the way she'd stumbled, the sickening crack as her head hit the rocks, the silence that followed. I'd told myself it was an accident, that I hadn't meant for it to happen. But the voice in the back of my mind had always known the truth. I'd panicked. I'd buried her here in this forest, and I'd tried to bury the memory along with her. Now, the earth was forcing me to remember. When I landed, it wasn't on solid ground. It was on a mound, soft and shifting beneath my weight. I rolled off instinctively, my hands sinking into the dirt. It wasn't dirt, it was her grave. The mound shifted and moved, and I scrambled back as skeletal hands began to claw their way out. First one, then another, until the entire forest floor was writhing with them. The whispers turned to screams, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. She emerged last. Her figure rose from the grave, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a terror deeper than anything I'd ever known. "This is your grave now," she said, her voice resonating with the force of the earth itself. The hands reached for me, skeletal fingers clawing at my legs, my arms, dragging me down into the earth. I struggled, screamed, but it was no use. The dirt swallowed me, filling my mouth, my nose, my lungs. As the darkness closed in, her face was the last thing I saw. The darkness was absolute, suffocating in its completeness. For a moment I thought I was dead, buried beneath the weight of the forest floor. But then I realized I was still breathing, or at least I thought I was. The air was thick and cold, scraping my throat like shards of ice with every gasp. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, as if the earth were still clinging to me. Panic clawed at my chest as I clawed at nothing, the sensation of dirt beneath my nails more vivid than anything else. And then, as suddenly as it had swallowed me, the earth released me. I fell again, but this time the landing was soft. I hit a cold, wet surface that felt like mud, but didn't behave like it. It clung to me, thick and viscous, tugging at my clothes and skin as I tried to stand. The whispers were back, louder than before, but this time they weren't disjointed. They formed a single voice, many in one at the same time, echoing from every direction. "You can't escape," it said, low and resonant, vibrating through the air and into my chest. I turned, desperate to find the source, but the world around me was unrecognizable. The twisted forest was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of black mud, broken only by jagged skeletal trees that jutted out of the ground like grotesque monuments. Above me the sky churned with unnatural colors, a sickly green streaked with veins of purple and black. It wasn't the world I knew. It wasn't any world at all. The voice continued, weaving through the oppressive silence like a thread. "Do you see now, John? The past doesn't stay buried. It festers. It grows. And eventually it drags you back." My name on its tongue was like a curse, each syllable a heavy weight pressing on my chest. "I don't belong here," I said, though my voice was weak and uncertain, swallowed by the vastness of the void around me. The voice laughed, a sound that reverberated in the pit of my stomach. "You made this place, John. Every lie, every choice, every shovel of dirt, it built this. This is your grave." I shook my head, stumbling forward through the muck. "No, I didn't mean to." The words felt hollow, even as I said them. My memories betrayed me, flashing before my eyes in perfect clarity. Emily's laughter, the warmth of her smile, the way her eyes had widened in shock just before she fell. "You chose to forget," the voice accused. "You chose to run, but the earth remembers, and so do I." The mud beneath me began to shift, rippling like water as skeletal hands emerged once again. They clawed at me, grasping my legs, my arms, pulling me down. I fought against them, thrashing wildly, but the more I struggled, the stronger their grip became. "You can't run from yourself," the voice said. "You can't run from her." A figure rose from the mud ahead of me. At first, it was indistinct, a shadow against the swirling sky. But as it moved closer, its form became clearer, and my heart sank. It was Emily, or what was left of her. Her face was a mask of decay, her hollow eyes glowing with a pale, sickly light. Her mouth twisted into something between a smile and a snarl, and her hands, those skeletal, mud-streaked hands, reached out toward me. "You promised," she said, her voice layered with the whispers. "You promised I'd be safe." "I didn't mean to," I stammered, tears burning my eyes as I struggled against the hands pulling me down. Her voice, thick with sorrow and anger, clung to the air, each word sinking deeper into my chest. "You left me, John. You left me there to rot, and now you will too." I could feel her fingers, cold, unyielding, slipping around my arms, pulling me into the sinking muck. It was like being dragged into the very heart of the earth, her face twisted grotesquely, its hollow eyes staring straight through me, as though accusing me of every sin I had buried in the past. "You promised," she repeated, the words now laced with the whispers of the voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You promised you'd never leave me." I was drowning, the weight of my guilt dragging me down into the cold, dark embrace of the earth. My legs felt heavy, weighed down by the mud, the skeletal hands that kept pulling me deeper. "No, Emily, please," I begged, my voice cracking under the pressure. But the more I screamed, the further I sank. The mud crept up my chest, up my neck, over my face, until all I could feel was the cold, the suffocating pressure of the earth closing in. "I didn't want this," I gasped, the words suffocated by the thick, wet soil that was filling my mouth. But Emily only stared at me, her face a mask of death, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The earth around me began to pulse with a rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat, and I could hear something else, something worse. A voice I knew well but hadn't heard in so long, spoke through the static of the air. It was my own voice, but twisted, broken, distant. My screams, my pleas echoed through the endless void. I could feel it now. The radio was alive. It was playing my agony. The static that had been my prison was now my tormentor, broadcasting my screams for all to hear. The next morning, my car was discovered, abandoned on the side of the highway. The windows were rolled down, the door slightly ajar, the scent of musty air and rusted metal lingering inside. There was no sign of me ever even being there. The keys sat in the ignition, the engine cold, but the radio was still playing. The static was relentless, crackling through the speakers like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. It didn't stop. The officers who found the car searched the area. They scoured the nearby woods, checked the highways, but there was no trace of anyone. No footprints, no signs of a struggle. Just the car, abandoned in the middle of nowhere, its radio buzzing with static. But the graveyard I had seen, the one I had stumbled upon in the depths of the night, was nowhere near the car. It was as if I had never been there at all, as if the earth had swallowed me whole and left no trace behind. It was late at night when a trucker, driving along the same stretch of highway, picked up the signal. The radio in his truck buzzed with static at first, the familiar interference of late-night frequencies. But then something more emerged. A voice that sounded like it was trapped within the static. "Please help me." The trucker tightened his grip on the wheel, his eyes darting nervously to the road ahead. The voice, my voice, was faint but clear, desperate, pleading. I can't breathe." His fingers hovered over the radio dial, unsure whether to turn it off, but he couldn't look away. The voice continued, distorted and broken, like someone reaching out from beyond the veil, trapped in a static prison. "Please, I didn't mean to." The trucker's eyes widened. His heart began to pound in his chest, and a shiver ran down his spine. There was something wrong about it, something deeply wrong. The voice was begging. It sounded like it was calling out from within the radio, as though it was coming from the very air itself. "John!" His breath hitched. He didn't know who John was, but the name echoed through the static, and the chill that washed over him was like a death sentence. A foreboding sense of dread filled his mind, warning him that this wasn't just another strange radio signal. The trucker glanced nervously at the dark, empty road, his eyes flickering between the dashboard and the void outside his window. The static crackled louder, like a growl from some unseen beast. The voice was coming from all around him now, filling the cab of the truck, closing in on him. "I'm still here," my voice whispered, faint and fragile, but with an undeniable urgency. "I'm trapped. Please, help me." The radio began to hum louder, almost vibrating with the sound of my screams, the distortion turning into something darker, something unholy. It was as if the very frequencies were alive, pulsing with the rhythm of my pain. The trucker's hands trembled as he turned the dial, trying to adjust the radio, but it was no use. The static only grew louder, the voices becoming more frantic, more desperate. The air in the truck grew thick with cold, the temperature plummeting as if something was trying to break through. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't escape it. The voice now screamed, tearing through the static, the words coming fast and disjointed, but there was no mistaking the terror in them. "Help! Help me! I'm still here, trapped, please!" The trucker slammed his foot on the brake, screeching to a halt on the side of the road. His breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. The voice didn't stop. It was still there, still calling to him, still reaching out through the radio, through the static. But there was no one else, just the empty night stretching out ahead. And then, for a moment, the radio went silent. The trucker sat in the dark, his hand still clutching the wheel, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the voice to return. And then, from the depths of the silence, a final whisper broke through. "It's too late." The static came back with a vengeance, louder than ever before, crashing against his eardrums like a storm. He could feel it now. The radio, the static, the voice. It was all connected. All of it was calling to him, pulling him into the dark void. He turned the radio off, but it didn't matter. The static didn't stop. It lingered in the air, a warning, a curse, a voice trapped in the signal forever.